There were a number of topics, actually there were only a couple that we didn't get to in class today, so we're going to have this very short video lecture to finish this topic of genetics or inheritance. And what we got to so far was this idea that there's these alleles, versions of genes that come in pairs because we have homologous chromosomes. We have homologous chromosomes because we have parents, mother and a father. So far, we looked at the very simple case of one trait. Just one trait, one single trait. You can roll your tongue, you can't roll your tongue. You've got earlobes attached, you don't have earlobes attached. You've got purple flowers, you've got white flowers. You know that if you think about your own body, your own self, that there are thousands of traits. This idea of looking at the traits that parents have and being able to predict what kind of traits the offspring are going to have, well, that makes sense. Easy enough. One trait, two different possibilities, two different alleles. But what about two traits? In reality, there's 46 chromosomes. There's 23 pairs of chromosomes. Each one of those chromosomes has hundreds of genes that are related to hundreds of traits. So if we just go a little more advanced, but not much, just a little, and talk about two traits at the same time, then it gets a little more complicated. And that's this next subject is the inheritance of multiple traits. So this is the point that I was making, that so far we looked at one trait, a big P, a little p, something like that. But on our chromosomes and within our genes, there could be 25,000 genes that are related to 25,000 different traits. And so we might have been talking about a trait R, whether you have round seeds or wrinkled seeds, a capital R and a little r. We might have been talking about a big P and a little p. But if you're talking about two traits at once that are on different chromosomes, and you're thinking about the passing on of these traits from the parents to the offspring, then there's even more possible combinations of those two traits. With a single trait, you could be homozygous dominant, you could be homozygous recessive, or you could be heterozygous. There's three different possibilities, 3-to-1 ratio. Two of those are, if you're talking about flower color, the purple flowers. A third one is purple flowers. The fourth one for homozygous recessive would be white flowers. So there's 4 different possibilities in terms of genotype, 2 different possibilities in terms of phenotype, or 3 different genotypes, 2 different phenotypes, purple flowers and white flowers. If you're talking about 2 traits, then let's say color, whether you have red or pink or red or white, then the trait that you're talking about is some kind of a color, flower color or eye color, designated as an R. And you're also talking about height, for instance. Tall is capital T, and the recessive allele is short, and that's a little t. So you get one allele for those traits from each parent. So your mother is giving you an R, your father's giving you an R, your mother's giving you a T, your father's giving you a T. Now, what possible combinations of these R's and T's are there? It's more complex than just a 3-to-1 ratio. So for instance, if the parents that are donating these alleles to you are heterozygous for 2 traits, if you look up here, heterozygous for these 2 traits. So for T, they've got a dominant allele and a recessive allele. For R, they've got a dominant allele and a recessive allele. That's heterozygous, not for 1 trait, but for 2 traits. So this parent now is going to make gametes. It's going to make sperm, or it's going to make eggs. They only have half of the chromosome number of the diploid cells, so they don't have 2 T's and 2 R's. They've only got 1 T and 1 R because it's a sperm or it's an egg. When an egg gets fertilized by sperm, then there's going to be 2 T's and 2 R's in the offspring, but not in the gametes. So the gametes, the sperm or the eggs, have 4 different possible genetic compositions. You could have a gamete that's got a big T and a big R. You could have a gamete that's got a big T and a little r. You could have a gamete that's got a little t from the father and a big R from the mother. You could have, or this is actually from the same parent, the allele for height is recessive and the allele for color is red. Or you could produce a gamete, a sperm or an egg, that's got both recessive alleles. So notice here, there's only 1 T and there's only 1 R in a gamete. In the offspring and in the parents, there's 2 T's and 2 R's. So this is the genetic makeup of a parent. This is the genetic makeup of a sperm or an egg from one of those parents. So Mendel looked at these 2 traits at a time. He counted purple flowers and yellow seeds or green seeds and wrinkled, whatever, a couple of traits at a time, and he counted how many offspring had both dominant traits. How many offspring had 1 dominant trait and 1 recessive trait? How many offspring had the other dominant trait but the other recessive trait? How many offspring had both recessive traits? And he added up all the different combinations, and he came to the conclusion that the ratio for these hundreds that he's counting was 9 to 3 to 3 to 1. So what does that mean? We'll look at that in more detail. But basically, 9 out of 16 offspring combinations are going to have both dominant traits. They're going to be T, a big T, and a big R. Doesn't matter what the other one is. They've got 1 big T and 1 big R, so they're tall and red. 3 out of 16 are going to have 1 dominant trait. For instance, they would be red, but then the other trait is recessive. They'd be red and short. 3 out of 16 possible combinations are going to result in offspring that are short, but red instead of tall and white, or whatever the other color is. And there's only 1 out of 16, 1 chance out of 16 that the offspring is going to have both recessive alleles, or it's going to be 2 little t's and 2 little r's. Okay, so what happens is that these parents are making gametes. The gametes only have 1 allele. Here's a parent that's got 2 dominant alleles, P's. This parent is making gametes that only have 1 P, not 2. This is diploid, this is haploid. This is the parent cell, this is the gametes, eggs or sperm. You could have a homozygous recessive parent. They can only make gametes, sperm or eggs that have the recessive allele, or you could have a heterozygous parent that could make 2 different types of gametes. One gamete has a dominant allele or capital P, and another version of that gamete is going to have a little p, or have a recessive allele. That's how these alleles are being distributed when gametes are being made. So here's another parent cell that's heterozygous. It's got a big B and a little b. And then there's these gametes, sperm and egg, are being produced in meiosis, that cell division that we looked at. And so there's going to be a big B that could go into some gametes, or there could be a little b that go into some gametes. Remember, meiosis starts out with 1 cell. And when you're done with meiosis, the 2 cell divisions that occur during meiosis, you've got 4 cells that result. You start out with a diploid cell, you end up with 4 haploid cells. So in humans, this is a cell that's got 46 chromosomes. These are all cells that have 23 chromosomes. These have 46 chromosomes because they've got 2 B's and 2 versions of every chromosome. These have 23 chromosomes because they only have one of the parent's chromosomes. They have one allele. Some of these are the fathers and some of them are the mothers and mixed together. So taking this to the next level, if you're talking about, for instance, these pea plants, and you look at these 2 traits, seed color, 2 versions. You can have yellow seeds or you can have green seeds. The dominant version of that allele is yellow. Or you can have green, which is the recessive allele. So color, yellow, is the dominant one, capital Y. And then these pea seeds have different shapes. They can be either smooth or round, or they can be wrinkled. So smooth is a dominant trait. That's a capital S. Wrinkled is a recessive trait. That's a lowercase s. So what Mendel did was he did these crosses enough times so that he was sure that he had a parent that was heterozygous for both traits. That's this heterozygous for smoothness, which is a capital S and a little s. Heterozygous for seed color, which is a yellow, capital Y and a little y. That's heterozygous for 2 traits. Now, normally you'd have 2 different parents, but these pea plants, they could fertilize themselves because these pea plants have a female reproductive parts and male reproductive parts. But it's like 2 heterozygous individuals, one that's contributing the sperm and one that's contributing an egg, or one that's contributing a pollen and one that's contributing the ovule. So this diploid cell, this organism with 2 alleles for S and 2 alleles for Y, is going to produce gametes, sperm or eggs or pollen. This is diploid. These gametes that are produced in meiosis are haploid. So the male part of this plant is producing pollen. It's got 1 S and 1 Y, 1 S and 1 Y, 1 S and 1 Y, 1 S and 1 Y. The combination, though, could be a capital S and a capital Y. It could be a capital S and a little y. It could be 2 little lowercase letters, or it could be a little s and a capital Y. Those are the possible gametes that this heterozygous parent can make. This is the same parent, just self-fertilizing. Then the female part can also make gametes that have these possible combinations. So these are haploid cells because they're gametes, like pollen, and ovules, like sperm and egg. They've only got 1 version of every allele. Now, if you combine these together when an egg is fertilized or when an ovule is pollinated, now you're back to having 2 S's and 2 Y's. So what are the possible combinations? You could have 2 big S's and 2 big Y's. You could have 2 big S's, a big Y, and a little y. You could have a big S and a little s, a big Y and a little y. If you match these up, these 2 capital S's and these 2 capital Y's, these 2 capital S's and this capital Y and that little y, if you fill in the chart here, you see there are 16 different possible combinations. If you're combining the alleles from these 2 parents, 2 heterozygous parents, there's 4 different gametes that they can make, and there's 16 different combinations of those gametes. Now, if you look at the phenotype of those, in other words, are they yellow or are they green? And are they smooth or are they wrinkled? And this is where you see that 9:3 to 3:1 ratio. 9 of these have at least 1 big S and 1 big Y. That's a dominant allele, a dominant version of that trait, which means that they're smooth and they're yellow. 3 of them have the dominant smoothness trait, so they are smooth, but they have the recessive, 2 little y's, color trait, which means they're not yellow, they're green. And then 3 of them have one big Y, at least one big Y, so they're yellow, but they've got 2 recessive alleles for seed color, or smoothness, rather, not color, but smoothness, and they're wrinkled. 3 of these are wrinkled and yellow, 3 of them are smooth and green. That's the 9:3 to 3 to 1 ratio. The 1 is the proportion of the offspring that has both recessive alleles. It's got 2 little s's and 2 little y's. The probability is 1 out of 16, 1/16, about 6%, that an offspring is going to have both recessive alleles. This is what Mendel did. He took hundreds of offspring and counted how many of them had yellow seeds, how many of them had yellow seeds and were wrinkled, how many of them had green seeds and were smooth. He looked at the proportion of offspring for hundreds of these to see what the combinations of these 2 traits were. And he did this multiple times with multiple traits. And he came to the conclusion that the ratio that you get when you cross 2 heterozygous parents was 9:3 to 3 to 1. All right, well, there's other combinations. You don't always have 2 heterozygous parents. So I could give you an example, or maybe you've got the knowledge about the genetic makeup of one of these parents. And so this is the example here, is that you've got 1 heterozygous parent, big T and little t, big R and little r. That's a heterozygous parent with 2 alleles, 2 versions of this trait that can make 4 different types of gametes. The gametes that that individual can make, you can see down here, can have a big T and a big R, it can have a big T and a little r, it can have a little t and a big R, it can have 2 little letters, lowercase letters. That's what this parent can make in terms of gametes. This parent is going to be crossed with, or it's going to mate with, produce offspring with, a parent that's homozygous dominant for both traits. Homozygous means they're the same, so they're all going to be capital T and capital R. Dominant means they're going to be capital as opposed to lowercase. So that parent, this parent here, this homozygous dominant for both traits, it can only produce 1 type of gamete. Every gamete that this individual produces is going to have a big T. Look, what else is it going to have besides a big T? Nothing. And a big R. What else can it possibly have? Only big R's. So this is a gamete. It only has 1 T, not 2 T's, but 1. And it only has 1 R. So all the gametes are going to have 1 of these T's and 1 of these R's. That's this one. There's only 1 possibility for this father producing sperm. So then if you draw a Punnett square and you match these up, then you see there's 4 different possibilities. You can be homozygous dominant for both parents, like the father. You can be homozygous dominant for height and heterozygous for color. You can be heterozygous for height and homozygous dominant for color, or you can be heterozygous for both. So there's only 4 different combinations here, 4 different genotypes. But if you think about the color and the height of these, every single offspring, 100%, the only possible combination is going to be that all these offspring are going to be tall and they're going to be red. All right, well, one last thing to talk about are this 23rd pair of chromosomes that we have. In males, that pair is at XY. In females, it's XX. So what exactly does that mean? Well, if you're a female, you got an X chromosome from your mother and you got an X chromosome from your father. If you're a male, you got an X chromosome from your mother and you got a Y chromosome from your father. That's what makes you male. There's certain genes on an X chromosome and there's other genes on a Y chromosome. They're different from one another. X chromosomes have more genetic material, they're bigger, and they have more DNA and more genes. Y chromosomes are smaller with less genetic material, less DNA, fewer genes. So there's certain traits in populations where the gene that's responsible for that trait is on the X or Y chromosome. And again, there's more genetic material, more genes on the X chromosome, so there's more of these traits occur on X chromosomes than Y chromosomes. So there's some traits that are called sex-linked, which means that they're traits that are coded for by some gene that's on the X or Y chromosome. And so there's some traits that are more common in males, there's some traits that are more common in females. Since there's more genes on X chromosomes, and it's more common that males are affected by this than females, because females are getting X chromosomes from both parents. Males are only getting an X chromosome from one parent, from the mother. So there's some traits where the gene for that trait are on the X chromosome. Then the only way that a male, a son, is going to be influenced by the trait is from the X chromosome that it gets from its mother. So the mother's going to have a big influence on what that son looks like in terms of that trait. So here's an example with color blindness. Color blindness is more common in males than females. Why is that? Because the color blindness gene is on X chromosomes. So if you're a female, you get two X chromosomes. If one of those X chromosomes has this mutation for being colorblind, it doesn't mean you're colorblind. You've got one X chromosome with a good allele that allows you to synthesize these proteins that allow you to see colors. So you get two X chromosomes if you're a female. If one of them has this gene for colorblindness, that doesn't mean you're colorblind. If you're a male, though, you only get one X chromosome. Whatever X chromosome you happen to get is going to influence whether you're colorblind or not. So look over here with the genetic makeup of these different offspring. If you've got a son that got an X chromosome without the color blindness gene, then they're going to be normal. They're going to be able to see because they didn't get an X chromosome with that color blindness gene. If they did get an X chromosome with that color blindness gene, they're going to be colorblind because what they're getting from their father isn't influencing that trait at all. They don't get any gene from their parents, from their father. All the color blindness related genes are coming from their mother. So if you get one X chromosome with this recessive allele, you're going to be colorblind if you're a male. If you get one of those recessive alleles from your mother and you're female, you're not going to be colorblind because this X chromosome contains regular gene that allows you to synthesize a protein related to seeing colors. Now here's an example that a lot of people are familiar with is calico cats. And a lot of you probably know that every calico cat is a female. You don't have any male calico cats. That's because in order to be a calico cat, you've got to get two X chromosomes, each of which has these different factors on it, or these different genes. So look, here's a calico cat. Looks like this. It's got an X chromosome with this part of it, this gene, and it's got an X chromosome with this gene. If you've got those two X chromosomes, that's what you look like. If you're a regular colored female, you only got one of those. This dark colored female, you only got one of those, not two. And if you're a male, you don't get an X chromosome. You get an X chromosome and a Y chromosome, X chromosome and a Y chromosome. So this is the analogous to an X chromosome, and this is analogous to this is the type of other X chromosome that you have. Anyway, you've got to get both of these to be calico. You have to have two X chromosomes, basically. And of course, if you've got two X chromosomes, you're female. You can't be calico with one X chromosome. Okay, another interesting thing is, well, there's a lot of different traits that we have, but something is the ability to smell. You know, if you eat asparagus and the smell that is in your urine, it's an interesting thing. It's a genetic thing. So if you eat asparagus, you produce this sulfur compound that leaves your body in urine. And that's what people produce. If you eat asparagus, that's what's produced in your urine. And when you urinate, that smell emanates from your urine. So the majority of people have the gene. It's not producing that smell, but it's being able to smell that smell. You have the gene that produces a protein that's involved in the sensory perception of that smell. You can smell that sulfur smell if you have that gene. There's other people that didn't get that gene and they can't smell well. If they ate asparagus and urinated, they wouldn't be able to smell it. Anyway, there's a lot of examples of this. The majority of people can smell when somebody, well, probably themselves most of the time, when you eat asparagus, you can smell that smell in your urine soon after you've eaten it. So that's another interesting thing. Okay, well, that takes us through this heredity and genetics, and then the rest of the week is going to be on DNA, RNA, making proteins, and so that's what we have to look forward to.